Hello everyone, Dr. Reese Goodall here and welcome to this video. And in this skills video, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm essentially going to be doing a masterclass that summarizes a lot of the smaller pieces that I've done thus far. This will be a longer video than I customarily produce. And I want to reflect on academic writing and essentially do a masterclass of how you prepare for academic writing, how you should sort of effectively structure, and how you should engage with sources, how you can edit and sort of make sure that your work runs as well as and smoothly as it can do. So this is going to be a bit more PowerPointy, PowerPoint a bit more. This is going to be on a PowerPoint. I'm going to include some examples from my own work. I've done a diagram where I sort of try and explain my thought process and thinking about some things. So hopefully this video will be of some use to you guys if you are doing academic writing for your own or looking to refine your skills. The plan for the video, as I've said, is I'm going to reflect on 5 main things. So firstly, when you're preparing to write, what should you do? How should you sort of set yourself up for success? Then when you are actually writing, what should you do? So this is things about how you structure, the kind of questions you should ask, how you should interrogate the sources and materials that you use, then tips for proofing and editing. So it's very, very easy to sort of trip up on sort of proofing errors, editing errors. So I wanted to really offer some thoughts on and some strategies on things that I do, things that I use, that help me out when I am trying to sort of make sure that my work is as smooth and sort of error-free as I can do. I want to talk a little bit more about secondary sources. I'll complement the video that I already have on secondary sources, which I will link in the description below. And then I want to offer some sort of general tips, tricks, things that don't necessarily fall into their own category, but which I think are useful to think about, some sort of strategies and ideas that can be really, really useful. So section 1 is sort of what comes first. It's the preparing for writing. And a strong piece of academic writing, you think about this, you do the work for this long before you ever put pen to paper or put your fingers to the keys. It is academic writing, if you haven't sufficiently prepared, is so much more difficult than writing where you've thought about it, where you've sort of got your resources, where you've got everything figured out to some degree in advance. You can really set yourself up well and make the writing process a lot easier by preparing for it effectively in the first place. So some tips. So often when you're doing academic writing, you are responding to a question. You're responding to some form of prompt. You're interrogating a quote. You're talking about a particular time period or a contextual period. You're closely reading a source or sources. When you are picking a title, when you're choosing an essay question, when you're choosing sort of a thrust for piece of academic writing, choose one that gives you enough to say. How do you do this? Well, I'm going to link to a video down below that sort of really goes into this in more detail. But really, it's pointless choosing something where you don't think you're going to be able to say enough, where you don't think you're going to be able to go into enough detail, to be able to really sort of come up with anything interesting or useful. When you have the idea, when you have your question, when you have your main argument, do your research around it. So in an academic context, all of these will pretty much be linked to lectures, to seminars, to workshops. So revisit your material from those sessions. Revisit essentially all the notes you took at the time, notes you took in the lecture, notes you took in the seminar, notes that you sort of collated afterwards, notes as you were doing the reading. And see what you find there. Were there any things that sort of struck you at the time that you think would be really useful, or alternatively would be a sort of a bit of a dead end to go down? Re-examine the source or the sources that you're looking at. So really the start place of any piece of academic writing is a source. It's a study, it's a survey, it's whatever. There is going to be something that will be a key piece of reference. it'll be the source that you do sort of most of your close reading around, the key source that sort of inspires your argument or reinforces it, or it may be two or three sources that do that. But whatever you think is sort of the key text, the key source for a piece of writing, revisit it. Go through it again, reread it, rewatch it, re-listen to it, whatever. Make notes again, see again what leaps out at you, see what things are useful there for you. And then read around the topic as well. This is essentially all the sort of the secondary material, right? When you have an idea, when you have a source, when you know what you're talking about, look around it. Look at the secondary sources that have been suggested by reading lists, by the library, by lecturers, the sources that you found during your own research. Again, it's in my video down below on secondary sources. And sort of find what the arguments are, find what people have said about the source, about the question that you're discussing. Is there lots of useful stuff there that you can run with, or stuff that you agree with, stuff you disagree with? I'll come into this more later. Figure out your argument early on. Know what case you are making, right? Essays that I've marked in the past, pieces of academic writing that I think are not very good, is where I'm not entirely sure what the point is, by which I mean the point that they are making. So figure out what argument you're making, and then use that as the backbone for everything. Use that as the backbone for your intro, for your conclusion, videos on those down below, but also use it to sort of figure out things like structure, to figure out things like the order of text, use it to figure out which examples are the best ones. Really, fundamentally, the structure and the logic of a piece of academic writing is based around the argument, and that really should underpin every choice that you make. And then lastly, planning. So some people plan, some people just write. I'm a big fan of planning. What form planning takes is up to you. So it may be the case that you scribble a few sort of orders of paragraphs on paper. It might be the case that you go into sort of massive detail and sort of each paragraph. This is the thing you're going to write about. This is the secondary source. This is your quote. That ultimately doesn't matter. I mean, you can come up with whatever works best for you. I'm happy to talk about planning techniques in a future video if that's of interest. Please do comment below. But figure out. I think it's useful. I really would recommend having a plan in advance. So that plan, knowing what your argument is, knowing which examples you're going to draw on, knowing which quotes, materials, ideas you're going to pull out from secondary resources, and sort of knowing, I think, if not the specific details of the nuts and bolts, although you're very welcome to do that, at least the through line of how your argument builds. If you have all of those pieces, when you're writing, it's markedly easier because you sort of know everything. It's just a matter of pulling it together and using the English, using the language around that to make the writing work. So you've done all that prep work, and we shift on to questions of writing itself. And these tips may feel very general, but I think sometimes the general ones are the ones that really can trip people up. So in terms of structuring, there's a general structure to academic writing, and you don't feel you have to fall into this, but my gut is that a good 95% of all sort of academic pieces are going to be in this wheelhouse of sort of an introduction, having points with examples, and then a conclusion. On my next slide, I'm going to come back to that. One of the questions that is always asked by students is, how many examples should you use? How many secondary sources should you use? My view is that it's better to discuss fewer things in greater detail. I think an essay or a piece of writing that uses, say, 3 examples in lots of detail is highly likely to be stronger than one that uses 20 examples in sort of no detail. Because again, it's a skill, sort of a judicious, careful choice of examples. Shows that you're sort of understanding the text. It shows you're not just sort of throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. It shows that you're able to look at a source, to look at a reading, to look at a secondary piece of material and think, this is the key idea, this is the most valuable thing, and I'm going to dig into it. So my own view is sort of, if in doubt, sort of err on the side of fewer things, but sort of in greater detail. And always be asking yourself, do things add to an argument? If things don't add, they're generally better not being there. I'm saying generally here. Link back to your main idea. So again, this is me talking about the argument. It's having a sense of how everything is connected to the main argument. Here, my quote here, a good essay is an interconnected essay, and this is true. There should be a logical reason for every paragraph, for every idea to be in this piece of writing. And that may be the case that it's a particularly good example of what you're talking about. It might be the case that it is a relevant piece of scholarship and literature that you are building on or arguing with. It might be the area where you're making your case. It might be the area where you're saying that this is what's missing. But in every case, you should really, there should be an obvious link to the argument or the main ideas of your essay or your writing. And then lastly, this idea of building. So again, I think a good essay when it comes to sort of structural dimensions is one that builds on each example. There's no sense using the best example, the richest one first, because then, in a sense, sort of, if you have less to say about the ones that come after, it reads as a bit weak. So carefully plan the order that you use examples, that you use readings. There should be a general flow, and if there's a reading or an example that only really makes sense after you've already talked about something else, again, making sure that that goes after. I'm saying this as an obvious thing, but I've seen pieces of writing that don't do this, that bring in an idea and then say, I'm going to come back to this later. Don't do that. Put it first where it's logical. And then talk about it, because then you've laid the groundwork. Effective laying of the groundwork really is it's a skill again. And let me show you this. So this is kind of, theoretically, this is kind of the main structure of any piece of writing. And I've broken it down here into three main ideas: the introduction, the main body, and the conclusion. And in an academic context, or indeed any sort of argument or essay writing context, these really are the three main points. An introduction, you saying that here is what you are going to do. The main body of your text. Here I am, I'm doing it, a little typo there. Remember that for the proofreading bit. And then the conclusion, you sort of reflecting on here's what I have done. I've talked about all of these in videos that are linked below, but a good introduction sets up the wider context. And we have to have a sense, it's no good saying I'm talking about Pride and Prejudice right away, because we don't understand what the context is that you're talking about that in. Are you talking about it as a book of its time period? Are you talking about it as a female authored book? Are you talking about it in relation to theory? Are you talking about it in relation to class? You know, you need to give a general scope of where we're working from. Then when you've given the general scope, then narrow it down. Narrow it down to your particular area, narrow it down to essentially say, here's a massive context and I'm focusing on this particular part of it, which will then lead me into the argument I'm going to make. I give more instructions on this in my introduction video. Then present your argument. You can never be too explicit with an argument. If the reader doesn't know what case you're making, that is a bad thing. So my own view is you can never be too obvious here. Obviously, aim for a little more inspired. If you can help it, then, you know, in this writing, I am going to argue that. You know, be a bit sort of more, exciting with it if you can, but make sure, leave no doubt in the introduction that the person who's reading it knows what case you are making. And then I think it's useful as well to explain how you're going to make the case, right? So through a close examination of these particular scenes from the book, through a interpretation of this film that uses these pieces of literature, you know, again, it's you saying, here's what I'm going to do. Not just the argument I'm going to make, but here is how I'm going to demonstrate it to you. Then the body itself, do what you've said you're going to do. So address the argument and use examples. And examples might be individual quotes. They may be scenes from books or films. They may be, it may be arguing with the scholarship itself. I've put a little guide here. Again, you don't have to be quite as rigid as this, but I think it's useful to have sort of 2 or 3 main ideas, main arguments, main examples, which follow on logically. Obviously, this is dependent very much on things like word count and the essay instructions or assignment instructions. Generally speaking, you don't want to be doing too much. This is the thing. A stronger piece of writing is a more streamlined, more focused piece of writing. And then lastly, the conclusion. Explain what you've done. How have you answered the question? How have you demonstrated the argument? I say it is quite literally you saying, here's what I've done. To the extent that I think, and I've said this in the videos linked below, that it's often quite useful to do the intro and conclusion after you've written the main body. But yes, a good conclusion effectively summarises everything that has come before. I'm going to show you an example of this later on. But then also demonstrate that you think bigger, that you know about the wider field. No piece of writing will ever capture everything. So what didn't you have the space to say? Why does that matter? You were writing about one thing and sort of you know that there's something useful to be said about this other thing, but it's not relevant to your argument. So future writing could do this. It could pick up on this. Things like that, again, that show sort of that level of original thought. I'm going to talk original thought in a coming video. Obviously exhibit original thought throughout the essay as well, but it's essentially showing that you know there is more to the argument, there's more to the field than just what you've written in the writing. So we leap forward again. So you've written a piece of work and then you want to proof it and you want to edit it. How do you do this? Now I'm going to offer some tips here, things I've done. It's worth noting, of course, that all softwares now have proofreaders, they have grammar checkers, all that sort of stuff. That is a useful thing to identify spelling errors, etc. I'd be very, very wary myself of using AI as a checker. I've seen a few essays that have been mangled by AI correcting it, I say in considerable inverted commas. If you do that, make sure you reread it again to make sure that you are essentially not damning yourself by using artificial intelligence in a way that sort of makes your essay make less sense. Proofreading is the art of going through. It's finding those grammar errors, it's finding mistakes and addressing them. The challenge of editing is something slightly different. It's the act of structuring, it's the act of manipulating a text, it's sort of changing things to make it stronger. I would ask yourself, does your writing flow? And again, this is the kind of thing that you've thought about already in the earlier stages. Is there an obvious direction through the piece of work? I put a solid narrative. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that, but is there a reason that example A is the first example, followed by example B, followed by example C? And is there a logical thing? You know, if you conclude your discussion of example B on whatever point, is it then logical or sensible that you would move to whatever you move to next? So think really hard about those sorts of transitions, because those are the kinds of things that, again, don't seem like a lot, but can really sort of do a lot of damage, and they're quite easy to avoid. And then this thing about, are your points detailed enough? So I said I would come back to this. If you don't have enough to say about particular examples, if you're sort of bringing up an idea and then only talking about it for a line or two, it's generally better to lose it. Because if you don't have enough to say about an example, it comes across often as essentially that you've thrown it in because you think it needs to be there, but you don't know how to engage with it. And that's not the impression you want to create. That is not the idea that you want to have. So ask yourself, are you going into enough detail on the things you're talking about? And how much detail is appropriate is, again, contingent on word counts. It's dependent on what you're doing with things. You may not want to argue with one source a lot, but you may want to argue with one more, and that's more relevant for a piece. So I can't give specific instructions, but are you saying enough to make the inclusion of a particular element worthwhile? And there we are, then again, some ideas on spell checking and sense checking. So there are 3 strategies that I've used myself that I found really, really useful after I've done a bit of editing and reading sort of just on my own back. Reading your piece of work backwards. What I mean by that is going sentence by sentence backwards. So there is a risk that essentially once you've written something, because you know what it says and because there's a flow to it that you've come up with, you can miss errors because your brain knows what it wants there. By reading it backwards sentence by sentence, you break up the flow, and it's often easy to see things that you would overlook. Reading it aloud, printing out your piece of writing or getting it on a screen and quite literally reading it out loud and making sure that you pay attention to every word that you've said. This is a great way of picking up if something doesn't sound right, because you'll say it and feel that it doesn't sound right. I think it's a really, really useful technique and one that I really recommend. Again, and then getting someone else to read it. Often when you've done writing, you're in your own world. And it's hard to see errors, it's hard to see things that don't make sense. A, because you've been staring at it for so long, and B, because you know what you're trying to say. So if you've got someone who can support you, generally I think it's better if it's someone who doesn't know anything about the topic or the idea. But anyone is better than no one. Ask them if they will read your writing. Ask them if they know what your argument is. Ask them if it makes sense. Ask them if there's a logical structure. Having sort of an external pair of eyes is really, really helpful. It's really valuable. And if in doubt, if you're able to do all three, it's always possible to over edit, but if you do these things, or at least one of them, you're likely to catch most of the things that will sort of trip you up. The stupid errors, the spelling mistakes, the sentences that don't make sense. Let me show you. Let me move on to this, and we'll move back. So I want to talk about secondary sources. Why has my PowerPoint broken? We will not be moving back. Yes, using secondary sources is a really, really valuable, useful way of getting to the higher marks. There's no right way, there's no right amount of using them. Again, I talk about this in a video I've linked below. The key thing is using them because they're relevant, using them because they in some sense complement the case you're making, they complement your argument, or indeed they challenge the case you're making so you can engage with them. A good essay uses a good amount of secondary material in ways that enhance it. So the ways that might be giving contextual detail, they might be supporting readings of the source, a key source more immediately. It might be the case that you're sort of using them to sort of look at the wider field, and you're using them to challenge them. I go into this again in more detail, but I think this is the sort of the challenge. There's no right or wrong way of using them. It's hard to use too many if you're in doubt. It's certainly possible to use too little. I've seen essays and pieces of work that use like only one source, which is sort of not really enough to give a sense that you know the field that you're talking about. But let the use really be governed because they're relevant to you, to your source, to your argument. I put here again some points that I think is useful for sort of finding useful secondary material. I talk about this in the another video which I've linked below on secondary sources, where you can find them. Look at reading lists, lectures, look at the sources that are used by the lecturers. Go to your library or look on the online library database. Go to Google Scholar. Look in the references of references that you already have. Is there one way a technique that I really quite use, and it doesn't always work, but there are examples of where it's helpful. It's generally contingent on luck and how popular a source or a field is. Is there a good reading that is specifically linked to the question you're answering or the argument you're making? Because if you can, that is a great chance to bring one in to sort of really critically engage with it, and in some cases even to really interrogate it. This is a skill that again emerges through looking around the field, through seeing what has been talked about in sessions and then your own research. But it is a handy thing to look into. And so if you can find a good reading that in some sense speaks to your question in ways that you find it useful or indeed not useful, that's a great way to bring one in. Another challenge of sort of critically interrogating secondary sources is gaps and limitations, and sort of one of the recognised ways of demonstrating sort of critical engagement with secondary material is saying where they've stopped, where their limits are, where they haven't functioned as well as you thought, and there are reasons for this. You're using a resource that doesn't directly speak to the argument you're making. You're using one that you're talking about 3 books, say, but the source you're using only talks about one of them. Things that are not inherently a problem, but you're acknowledging it as a potential gap. But there's often confusion and queries about how to exactly identify these gaps if you're not sure. I'm going to show you an example. So this is from a piece I wrote. From a article called John Kramer for President about authoritarian horror cinema. Often academic writing will, in its conclusion, identify its own gaps. So in this piece, I sort of wrote a general overview of a tendency I was seeing, and the bit highlighted in yellow is me sort of identifying my own gap. It's me saying, here's something that I wasn't able to do. And you will essentially always find this in academic writing, sort of the piece that's identifying its own gaps and sort of essentially indicating what future work, what future writing in the field might be doing. So you see here I'm saying I haven't been able to talk about gender, race, social class in massive amounts of detail in this piece. So if there's more work in this area, this is something it should talk about. It would be quite and effective and quite simple in a sense for a piece of writing using this source to say, well, the piece only goes so far talking about, say, social class, and I'm going farther. And as I say, most pieces of academic writing will have something like this. So if you're sort of in doubt, look to the introductions and conclusions of the sources that you're using, because they will generally give you a lot of the pieces you need there. So these are a bunch of tips and tricks and ideas. And I want to end with just a selection of tips, tricks, ideas that I have found useful in my own practice. Some of these may be useful for you, they may not, but I'm going to share them on the off chance. Look at the mark scheme. Look at every module material for a piece of work. Most places, if you're doing writing, will give you the criteria. They will tell you how they are going to assess that writing that you hand in, and they will tell you what they're looking for. Look at it, see what it's saying, see what the instructions of a task are, and see what the assessment guidance is. Most places will have this available, and it gives you the information. You know what you need to do to reach a particular mark, or things that you need to not do if you don't want to be lower down that. Look at everything across the module. So if there has been a useful resource produced by a lecturer, say, on how to analyse a particular source, or a useful worksheet or anything like that, look at it. All these materials are there to be helpful, to sort of set you up for successful writing. So take advantage of them. On that note, speak to your lecturers, speak to your seminar tutors, ask them if they are able to look at plans, if they're able to feedback on plans. They may be able to, they may not. Do it in good time if you want to sort of give yourself a fighting chance. But ask the question. If they say yes, you're going to get some guidance. If they say no, you're no worse off than you were before. It's sort of a minute, 2 minutes to write an email. And it could be really, really useful. It could give you guidance and things to avoid or things to sort of really focus on before you even start the writing process. Similarly, with these tutors, use their office hours, make appointments with them, and they are there to help. Go to them with focused questions. Go to them with specific things that you want to help, that you sort of want to ask. And it can be really useful to let them know in advance what you want to talk about, and because they're there to help. Again, it's no one who's in these jobs is there to sort of trip you up. And want you to do well. We want the academic writing to be good. We want you to sort of develop and be sort of amazing writers and scholars and thinkers. So do take advantage of the resources that are there. Similarly, essay feedback or other writing feedback. Have a look at what's been said. What can you do really well already? What are things that have been identified as strengths for you? What are things that have been identified as potential weaknesses for you? Are there pitfalls that you don't want to fall into in future writing? Have a look at these things and get to know them, because again, they are clues for what you're able to do well and things to make sure that sort of when you're editing to sort of double check that you don't fall into those same traps. On which note, don't lose the easy marks, right? So analysing, close reading, sort of critically engaging with scholarship, that is tougher. That is that's harder stuff to do. But things like making sure your writing makes sense, making sure your argument's clear, making sure that you don't have tons of misspellings, those are really easy things to avoid, and you don't want to lose the easy marks. Set yourself a baseline of not losing sort of any easy marks that you could start with just a bit of proofreading, a bit of spell checking, a bit of just going over the essay again and checking the structure. And what I would say to you is, lastly, look at good examples of academic writing. Are there particular sources you read that you think worked really well? Are there particular sort of scholars whose arguments really speak to you, that sort of really persuade you? What are they doing? A good writer is a good reader. I'm saying reader in sort of inverted commas there, and that might be someone who listens, might be someone who watches lots of video essays, it might be whatever. But a good writer is someone who is always critically engaging with other pieces of writing and work and learning from them. Can you take the good pieces? Can you sort of identify good nuggets? I've done this myself. I've read works that I thought worked really well. I've changed structures because I've seen other structures that I think work better for particular pieces of writing. I've seen arguments that were really strong, and sort of I've changed the way in which I structured essays. I've sort of played with headings, subheadings, whatever, based on learning from other scholars. But on that side note, if a reading or a source bores you, if it doesn't make sense, if you can't engage with it, what is it doing badly? What are the things that are stopping you from engaging with it? Are there things that you can avoid? And what are the pitfalls they're doing that you don't want to do? Because again, being able to identify things that trip up an essay, that make it less good, are really, really useful skills, which help you with your own writing. But it's also, again, you sort of critically engaging with a source. So it develops a multitude of skills while you're doing it. So look at the stuff that's good and try and learn from it. Look at the stuff that's bad and learn from it in a different sense. So there we go. This is I'm going to conclude here. So this has been a longer video than useful, but hopefully to some extent it has been really, really useful and helpful. If you like these long form videos, if you think they're going to be helpful, I can do more ones, but please do leave comments below. Let me know what else you'd want to see. If you're doing a piece of academic writing, good luck with it. I'm rooting for you, and hopefully some of the skills and tips and ideas in this video will help you out. On this note, I will conclude here. Thank you very, very much for watching. Please do comment below with any tips, ideas, suggestions of your own. Make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, make sure to ring the bell so you're notified when I have a new video out. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.